All right, welcome to the November 2nd meeting of the Amherst Zoning Subcommittee. As with all public meetings in Massachusetts, this meeting may be recorded by the audience or members of the board, and this meeting is being recorded by Amherst Media for later rebroadcast. I don't have an agenda in front of me.
Oh, here.
But I think it's pretty simple tonight. I don't have any announcements, and I believe we don't have any minutes.
That's correct.
So the primary purpose of the meeting from my perspective tonight is to talk about Article 17, current status of the article, and where we stand going into town meeting. We've gotten a lot of feedback. We got a petition at our last meeting from members of the neighborhood, and I've been thinking a lot about what we could do to basically improve chances of passage and try to get something from this article. We've had a couple of specific suggestions that have been proposed. One in the petition was doing away with the proposal to rezone the Montague Road area from RN to RVC. Another one was proposed by Hilda Greenbaum on several occasions and reiterated by her when I met with the ZBA last week, to change the regulation of townhouses from site plan review to special permit, which she thought was more appropriate. So those are the two biggest changes that are floating out there for us to consider. We've also got a couple other issues to talk about, or at least finalize with respect to the article. One of them is the timing, and this is more a planning board issue than a subcommittee issue, but I do want to talk about at our planning board meeting tonight. I've heard a lot of feedback about our proposal to postpone the article to the 16th of November. People are sensing that town meeting might proceed more quickly than that, and thus we might be unnecessarily prolonging things to make it the 16th. We had mostly selected that date because it corresponded with our next scheduled planning board meeting, and thus would be convenient for the board itself. But we'll need to talk about that at tonight's meeting, whether we could make that earlier or should make it earlier. And the other major issue I have to talk about tonight is the topic of division, north and south. We've kind of talked about this before. Jonathan's been getting a lot of questions about this and has been making an effort to respond to what will almost certainly be an attempt, if we don't initiate it ourselves, to try to divide this article into north and south. And he's got a fairly reasonable mechanism for doing that. So I think we need to talk about how to deal with that and how to respond to it, along with the two previous issues that I mentioned, the RVC zoning and the townhouse regulation, which again, almost certainly be raised as potential amendments to this that we will need to respond to, if not initiate ourselves. So, and I'll turn to Mr. Tucker to see if he has any other major issues or questions with regard to this article that we should be talking about.
No, you have in front of you a couple of options for motions, depending on at least two options. There may be others, depending on which way the board wants to go. The first one would simply move in terms of the article with the amendments discussed, or some number of amendments. The other would move to divide, and the division 1, 2, and 3 on the sheet is really sort of described on the back if you turn it over. There's one, we've discussed this before conceptually, if not in the article listing itself. This article has three components. The rezoning has three components. One are the form-based regulations themselves, independent of any zoning district or any reference to any location or streets. And the other two are those amendments that apply specifically to Atkins Corners and those amendments that apply specifically to North Amherst Village Center. We've had conversations with the moderator and with town council, and they are willing to entertain that kind of a division. They think that that can be made sensibly. I should report also, separate issue, there had been some discussion by concerned citizens that the way in which this was put on the warrant, that it was a listing of the places where changes were occurring and what kinds of changes were occurring, and then references to the specific documents in the hands of the office of the town clerk or the planning board, the Conservation and Development Office. And there had been some concern that that wasn't legal, that you couldn't do that. You had to have all of the language of the changes themselves in the warrant. Town council has made it very clear that no, you don't. So long as citizens have access to the actual changes, which they do both in the form of hard copies here in Town Hall in the offices listed or on the web.
As well as the mailing, which is
As
now
well as
gone
the
out.
mailing, which has now gone out. Everyone has they should have their hard copies. That for large changes like this, this is a perfectly acceptable and perfectly legal way to do it. In fact, part of this was modeled on the last time we did really huge changes in the bylaw, which was in the mid-late 1970s, through comprehensive changes throughout the bylaw that were simply too large to list on a warrant. You had to sort of refer to them and then provide the changes themselves in a separate form. So this is that question has been raised and answered.
Mhm. Thank you for checking into that. Okay. So with respect to the substantive changes that I mentioned, do either of you have thoughts on either one of those, townhouse regulation and RVC? Bruce?
I would be in favor of visiting both of those and talking about it and thinking about possibly going with the changes.
Mm-hmm.
I had a suggestion. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the notes with me for the Montague Road. I wondered about a compromise in which perhaps the properties abutting the Mill River could be either kept as the RVC or perhaps as limited business, and then the properties north of those would be left as they are. Because that way there would be an opportunity to do something with the river.
So, I'm sorry, the properties in the southern portion of the map be kept as our current proposal to RVC?
Only those that actually abut the river.
Okay.
And then above that, on Montague Road, just keep it as it is for now.
Okay. I guess I've thought a little bit about that also, keeping, what would happen if we kept part of this
Right.
as RVC, not necessarily that division that you just proposed, but more along the lines of a halfway or something. And my sense that the objections we've been hearing from the neighborhood are concerned about those particular properties in the south, the ones either near or immediately adjacent to the Mill River. And so I'm not sure how much of their concerns would be alleviated by that, because they're concerned about what could go, they seem to be concerned about what could go in on those particular properties that
Sure.
you
Oh,
mentioned. And
that's
so
true.
if we left that as RVC, it might not.
Well, I was thinking of
Address
perhaps
their concerns.
limited business, because then there could be still some businesses there, but I think that would be a lower scale, if I'm right, than the RVC would be, a smaller scale.
If I may, limited business is actually not a very low level in intensity use. It is moderately mixed, not very intentionally, but moderately mixed. And there is no reference in any of the existing regulations to having the form-based regulations apply in the limited business district. That would be a new addition that would be beyond the scope
okay.
of the article as it stands. I believe you would have to have those. Without any other change, you would still have the village form residence overlay, but there would be no language saying this overlay applies to this new underlying district in the following ways.
Okay. Well, then maybe it'd be better just to either stay with what we have or else just eliminate that altogether, rather than creating another district.
Right, because then you'd have a little island of DL
Right.
sitting there, yeah, which
Yeah.
would be a little bit strange too.
Yeah.
Did you have a comment, Rob? Go ahead.
Yeah. I definitely support changing townhouses to SP. And in thinking about the Montague Road issue, and also trying to prepare a presentation, I'm thinking that it's actually a bigger problem than is just listed here. I think the 134 property is part of Montague Road and is part of what people are talking about.
Sorry, which one is 134?
The W.D. Coles homestead?
Right, the homestead.
Okay,
Okay.
the part that's currently in the NAVC.
Right, they're currently proposed to be NAVC, but is currently actually RN.
Yes.
And I think that it makes sense for that property to be zoned similarly to the properties on Montague Road. And interestingly, the 116, which is the one just south of that, is part of that lot currently. But we're proposing to zone it to a different zone than 134. So I think that implies that, or that we assume that, that 116 will be cut off from that lot, will be A&R'd or whatever out of that lot. So why should we not also assume that 134 would also be A&R'd out of that lot? And if that's the case, it would have been a better proposal to suggest that that should be RVC in addition to all the other properties on the street. That would preserve I believe that it would preserve the current use of the property, so it wouldn't be creating or perpetuating a nonconformity. But if we're talking about leaving most of Montague Road as RN, but then upgrading part that is like right in the middle of it, it just seems a little strange to me. I think we should suggest leaving all of Montague Road RN, and then coming back later, next year, or if it doesn't succeed at town meeting with a different proposal, as, with proposing RVC or something else. I don't think BL is right, but maybe BN is right, or BVC or something, so that those ends match. And maybe it doesn't include the east side of Montague Road. Maybe it's just the west side, or maybe it curves around onto Coles Road. I don't know. I think, in other words, what I'm saying is, in considering this proposal, which I think is a good idea, it made me think that we're not done exploring all the implications here.
If I may, there is an implication, and I think the proposal as it stands was simply, and I think you know this, but just to state it out loud, I think the proposal to change the Article 17 as it stands is simply to take those properties that are currently proposed to be RVC and take them back to RN. That is to say, to not change their underlying district, but to retain the form-based overlay. The issue is that if you then change the 134 Montague Road back to RN, there is no form-based overlay on it now. Because the NAVC is a form-based district, it doesn't need the overlay. So the presumption, at least initially, was that the 134 Montague Road was appropriate as NAVC because it's an entry point, not only coming from the north along Montague Road, and it's a sort of an intrusion of what's going on, an intimation of what's going on to the west. So if people wanted to follow that, they would turn right on Coles Road and keep going into that area. It's an announcement of the presence of the village center. I don't think that it makes it illogical to have it stand alone as NAVC. There are other places, for instance, along Coles Road, where you have NAVC on the south side, and immediately across the street you have RN.
Yep.
I mean, that happens. You don't have to have perfect transitional coloring in the spaces everywhere. There are lots of places where it makes sense to have one next to another. So just to be aware that it is a relatively easy thing, and I think would go a very long way towards addressing people's concerns, if what is now proposed to be RVC went back to RN with the form-based overlay on it. It is a much more interesting and challenging thing to try and figure out what to do with what that portion of 134 Montague Road, which if you go by property lines, goes all the way over to Sunderland Road, which is currently zoned NAVC. If you want to change that to something else or not change it, you're leaving a pocket of property that doesn't have a form-based code over it.
Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's, I actually had not considered that. I assumed that the form overlay is extended, but it makes sense that it doesn't. But I also am not that concerned that the Coles business would, I mean, that's the archetype of North Amherst Village Center, so I'm not that concerned about it, but it is something to consider, I guess.
So a couple things, just to reiterate, we're basically talking about two different things, or two related things, two separate things. One is the possibility of taking the whole area that, in the map that I'm looking at, is sort of the greenish area that's proposed to be RVC, and removing that proposed change and keeping that area as RN. And then Rob is also talking about changing the proposal for what I'll call this finger on 134, the portion of that lot that fronts Montague Road, from the proposed NAVC to leave it as its existing RN. Without speaking to the merits of that specifically, I do think, Jonathan, if we wanted to do that, and I'm not saying that I do, but if we wanted to do that, I do think that a case could be made for extending the overlay district to cover that portion, because the proposal that's in the warrant, under the proposal that's in the warrant, that section would be covered by the form-based regulations via its inclusion in NAVC. And so extending the form-based overlay district, RVF, to cover that, I think a case could be made to the moderator that that would be within the scope of the article. I would actually argue against that. I agree that that property, the farmstead on the corner, does have connections both through being as part of the same property that extends along Coles Road and the larger property on the interior, as well as the continuous ownership and use over hundreds of years as being not just a residential single-family house. And I do think that NAVC is logical there. And I'm not particularly concerned with that house being torn down and replaced with something objectionable. We've been informed that that's certainly not the intention of the property owner. And while it doesn't make sense for us to stand on someone's representation of what they intend to do, I think that there's enough history associated with that property to assume that it's not going, or to at least have a fairly high degree of confidence in thinking that it's not going to change significantly. So that would be my preference. It would be to keep NAVC on that little section. But I am comfortable with removing RVC. Rob, one of the things that you suggested was the idea that this can go in stages, and we can look and we can evaluate, and that's a reasonable way of looking at it, I think. So I would support that.
I'm sorry, repeat for me what it is that is being supported.
So I just said that I would support the removal of the proposal to change the section along Montague Road, the green area, from RN to RVC. I would support keeping that as RN. And I think I heard all three of us say that, so I think that represents a consensus position of the board. I don't think we have consensus on the right way to approach the corner property that's currently zoned NAVC. I see we have a couple people in the audience who have commented on these issues multiple times, and because this does represent a change from what we've talked about previously, I'll invite comment if either of you have comments on what we've been talking about tonight. Or not, you're not obligated to. And if you do come up, I'd like you to use the mic because they can't hear you on ACTV unless you're talking to the mic. Thank you, Ms. LaCour.
Sarah LaCour, representing WD Coles, also Precinct 9, living in town. A couple of thoughts on the RN, RVC component. as it's been stated, the 134 property has always been part of what called its home farm, and it's operated any number of businesses for 100 years. And so, and I don't really know how the lot got split into RN and commercial somewhere in the 70s, but ideally, that home office would be included in an AVC in terms of, being able to keep that lot relatively together. The Hobart House had been a separate parcel once upon a time, so we're less. That's the next one. That's 116. We call it the Hobart House, and that wasn't historically part of the home farm. So that is logical that perhaps stay in. It's in the RN or the RVC, but our offices, we feel strongly, should remain part of the holistic piece of what's the former lumberyard and log yard and whatnot. Am I allowed to comment on the townhouse issue now, or do I need
Sure,
to wait
go
on
ahead.
that one? Okay.
No, go ahead.
The townhouse issue is a difficult one, and I understand everybody's dilemma. The problem with putting that to special permit is it leaves in a very large chunk of the land in North Amherst, it leaves no residential allowed by right other than in a mixed-use building. I mean, none. There's everything else is a no or a special permit. And I think if we're trying to look at gathering density in our village centers and getting some kind of enough people living there, a critical mass to allow for commercial activity, we've got to have people living there. And so for anybody coming in to do anything there, if the only residential is allowed at the upper floors of a mixed-use building, but that person, we can never rent any of the commercial space, we can't build. Whereas if we could build a few townhomes, perhaps on the north side of Coles Road, we get some people living there, we start getting some critical mass, and then some commercial retail could come in. I strongly think that there needs to be some wholly residential component allowed by right. I agree that apartments are not necessarily it, but townhouses I really think should be allowed by right, because I think you're really restricting the ability of anybody to get a critical mass of people living there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good points. I'll remind us also that and folks watching, that the proposed amendment includes definitions of townhouses and apartments, townhouses for the first time, and it defines townhouses as basically floor-to-ceiling units, so you can't have them stacked one on top of another, which makes them a lower density use, inherently lower density than what you could fit in the same building envelope for apartments, by and large, which was the basis for our choosing to regulate them through special permit in the original proposal.
I would note, just as a historical matter, we've done some preliminary research. We haven't had time to do research in greater detail, but it was between 1957 and 1963, which was about the time that Amherst started professionalizing its planning board. I think that corresponded roughly to the growing influence of the Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning Department of the university. People like Paul Procopio and others became involved in town government and the planning board and so forth. And at that time, they started to institute what were at the time state-of-the-art ways of approaching zoning, including the dreaded setback method, and I think this was one example of that. Again, we have not tracked it down to the specific town meeting at which it occurred or looked at that discussion, but that was the time frame within which it happened. It wasn't after the university grew, it was actually before, but during a period, the post-war period, when the university was changing and the composition of the town was changing.
Ms. Perot, yes.
Melissa Perot, 15 Summer Street. Of course, we're delighted that you're considering returning that parcel to RN. I'd like to say that while we have complete confidence that the Coles family will not do anything awful to the house on the corner, zoning does extend longer than the life of the present owner. And the economy and circumstances beyond that are out of our control, and the zoning stays put. And so I do have concerns about that. The other thing I'd like to say is that there is actually a critical mass there that would use businesses and services that presently get into their cars and drive in a way that the master plan was hoping they wouldn't, because there would be a village center to meet their needs, well, on foot or bicycles. We have a huge, a very substantially dense population there that would use the services and who have asked for them in their village community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One other point that I have, that hasn't been mentioned yet tonight, with respect to that 134 property, is that the proposed standards and conditions for apartments in NA, or anywhere actually, or no, just in NABC, would prevent them from being located closer than 100 feet to Montague Road. I think that's just apartments and not
Just
townhouses.
apartments, it's not townhouses.
And so that's actually a fairly substantial chunk of the width of that little finger that points out. So you actually wouldn't be able to put in anything high density along Montague Road directly. Rob?
Yeah, actually, that issue is, what made me think about this differently is that condition that wouldn't allow, would also allow, it also says for properties with frontage on Montague Road, apartments shall not have density higher than 10. So that 12 acres
Yeah.
has a frontage on Montague Road. So that's why I assume that it will not be part of that. I mean, maybe it will, but it just doesn't make sense to leave that as a part of that lot if you want to, really take advantage of what's possible within the triangle there.
Of course, it could be, right now it's part of the whole interior lot. It could be separated out.
That's what I mean.
It-
That's exactly what I mean. And so I'm thinking that it would be separated, whether it's NABC or not. You separate it so that you can put a density of 10 on that one if you
Right.
wanted to do that, which you probably wouldn't, but then, possibly 12 or 14, whatever, inside, rather than limiting yourself to 10 inside. So if we're thinking that that property is different than the rest of the triangle, then why are we saying that it should be viewed the same, that it should be zoned the same as within the triangle and not be zoned the same as the rest of Montague Road?
Mr. Tucker?
If I could respond to that, because you could draw a line that made sense for both this property with the frontage on Montague Road and the interior, and whatever uses anyone intended of the interior property with frontage on Coles Road or Sunland Road, and the range of uses that would be possible on that property would be consistent with, and could be made consistent with, the architecture that is there. For instance, if it's RN, you can't have an inn or a lodging facility there other than a little B&B thing, which is not really what we're looking at. Because of, again, going back to the arrival question, you're coming in from the north, this is a village center that provides services and goods and other things to communities well to the north, including to the east, Leverett, Shutesbury, some parts of Montague, Sunderland. People will be coming down Route 63 to come into this center. And this is a property that announces you have arrived in the center, and if you want the more active uses, you turn right, and if your destination is further on, you keep on going straight, and you still have that rural residential character as protected by the Village Farm Residence Overlay District all the way down to the river, whatever eventually decides to be done there. But for now, you're talking about RN the whole way, except for this, that this is a way of announcing the rest of it. And I think that from a planning standpoint, that makes arrivals and entrances are very, very important. So that's my attempted answer to your question. Why are we not treating this like it was just like the rest of this stretch? Because it's not just like the rest of this stretch. It's different.
Yes, Ms. Keller?
Janet Keller, 120 Pulpit Hill Road. I'd like to thank you for the microphone. I'm sure the people who don't hear well will be delighted. Thank you.
We try our best.
I know you do. I, too, am pleased to hear that you're considering returning that corner of Montague Road to RN. And I would like to offer another reason in addition to protecting the natural resources and farmland that surround it all, and for protecting the stable residential neighborhoods that also surround it. And would note that for the Columbia Pike form-based zone that the Cecil Group used for their flyer, I dipped into that a little bit and was very interested to see, and I don't know how these things all played out, although I have seen some of it because I visit Arlington fairly often to visit relatives. But I noted that protecting stable residential neighborhoods was one of the things they put provisions in for. And I have seen how that worked in some cases, and they have quite clearly delineated those and protected those, and it seemed to me a good thing, and I think it would be a good thing here as well. I would also note that in that plan, they noted 32 historic sites that were identified for protection, and they named them. So I want to mention that on the Town of Amherst Historic and Cultural Resources map, not only the historic center, the frontage along the north side of Meadow Street, and a tiny slice on the south side at the corner of 116, as well as the triangle near Joe's service station, and then all along to the north of Montague Road is marked for potential overlay district as a historic and cultural resources site. So that would be another reason, and it too is surrounded by a lot of areas marked in yellow on this map as quote, other areas meeting criteria. So it's a very important area to the culture and to the history of our town. So that would be yet another reason to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so I think we've achieved consensus on the green parcel. I think Rob and I still disagree on NAVC on the corner. I'm not sure where you stand on that, Bruce.
Well, go ahead.
I just want to make clear, I'm not saying that I think that property should be RN.
Mhm.
I think it should be RVC. But that's not really an option right now.
Right.
So the question is, how do we, what's the long-range plan? Is the long-range plan to not rezone most of Montague Road until later, and then try and downzone that, or whatever, to match it later, if that's what it should be? Maybe it wouldn't be necessary if we are successful in making the rest of Montague Road RVC at some point in the future, 5 years, 10 years, or 2 years, or whatever. But I'm just saying, I look at it as all one piece.
So the long-range plan, to whatever extent there is one, because that gets decided by this body and by town meeting, I continue to think RVC is appropriate and desirable zoning there for that stretch of Montague Road, and might make sense at some point in the future, particularly after we have a chance to see how the NAVC zoning works out. If it works out in a way that supports where we think that it's going to go, then I would hope that people there would see that and recognize it and view that as a desirable thing. But we'll have to see how that plays out.
If I may.
Mr. Tucker?
Ms. Keller raised a very important point that has been not lacking in Amherst's planning, because Amherst has actually planned a great deal around historic resources, but which has not been deliberately incorporated ever, that I'm aware of, in the town's approach to zoning. And that is, how do you treat, or do you respond in zoning in some way to specific historic sites as opposed to the general historic character, which is to a very great extent what the form-based regulations attempt to do, to replicate, protect, enhance, and continue that form. That's different from protecting individual properties from unwanted change. There are elements in our current zoning bylaw which allow permitting boards to review specific proposals and to use historic criteria. There is obviously the demolition delay tool that the town has to stop a delay, to stop a demolition for a period of a year while other alternatives are sought. It certainly could be the case that withholding a more mixed zoning for this stretch of Montague Row could allow time for planning, not only for the enhanced zoning, but for the Amherst Historical Commission to pursue a National Historic Register district, or perhaps even a local district along that stretch. What people have to understand is, if you pursue a local district is even stricter than zoning in terms of what you yourself can do with your property, so that there are always two edges to the blade, and one of the edges is always pointing back at us when we start using regulation. But it certainly, as was said, would be an opportunity to withhold from doing the RVC now, but to see what developed with the remainder of this while pursuing additional research and study of these specific areas would allow us to incorporate some of those elements, which we have not done before.
Do we have a larger map handy to look at that property?
Over here?
Over there?
Well, the right there.
See this? Does that help?
Okay.
Skews our back.
Thanks, Chris.
Do you want me to put this on an easel that's closer to you? so you can
No,
see
no, that's fine, thanks. I just wanted to see it, I
Okay,
see it here
thanks.
on Jonathan's map, but I wanted to take a closer look at it.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, you want to see this a little closer too.
How far then are we talking about this becoming RN?
I believe that the proposed border of the zoning districts, Jonathan, follows the back half of the property lines of the Coles
Yes.
property immediately to the south of there, right?
Yes.
So it would just follow
basically-
on up?
Yeah, so you're talking
Okay.
about that portion.
Okay.
This portion is definitely an NABC,
Mhm,
and
that's
so
what I
really
thought.
the extension of this line upward that
Mhm.
we're mostly discussing here.
Okay.
So I am going to propose that we support, and all of this needs to go to the board. We need to have a discussion at the planning board tonight to get their decision. But I'm going to propose that we support moving the portion zoned, proposed to be zoned RVC back to leaving that as RN, and also changing the regulation on townhouses from SPR to SP. I do that a little bit reluctantly because I think that Ms. LaCour has some valid points with respect to residential uses in NAVC. But I also have a great deal of trust in our permitting bodies to be able to view a proposal for townhouses and issue a special permit. So I think that would be a reasonable way of dealing with that. And so I would propose both of those, which would leave the NAVC zoning intact on that corner property, the farmstead property.
Second that.
Okay,
I would agree.
further discussion? All right, all in favor of that proposal? That's a 3-0 vote. Ms. LaCour?
Sarah LaCour. I would just like to point out that one of the issues with this, and I like I said before, I understand it's a dilemma, but essentially you're downzoning, but significantly increasing development costs. So right now, no new uses are allowed than what would be allowed under commercial, because we're allowed a mixed-use building with residential upstairs anyway, now in commercial. We were holding off doing that, but now development costs are significantly increased because we've got to build streets this way, we've got to build open space, and so we've gained nothing and significantly added to our development costs, which I'm not sure is how we envisioned getting something happening in our village center. I really having trouble with this because I don't see how this is ever going to help anybody wanting to now do something there, because nothing is essentially allowed by right. And it's not necessarily that I don't have faith in our ZBA either, but one of the strongest proponents for this is on the ZBA. I think this is going to be a real problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Keller?
May I ask a clarifying question from here, or?
If it's quick, I will echo your question so that the folks at home can hear it.
Thank you. I wonder if you could ask Ms. LaCour which downzoning she's referring to. I think I know what she means, but I'm not sure that I do.
The question to Ms. LaCour, which I'll give her the opportunity to respond to if she'd like to, is which downzoning, or in what sense of a downzoning she was referring to in her comments.
Under commercial uses, right now what's commercial, we're allowed a certain amount of uses, including light industrial, things like that, and then the mixed-use building. Hopefully, I'm trying to talk to you, but now under the NAVC, some of the commercial uses have been taken out. Mm-hmm. So we haven't gained anything. We can't do anything strictly residential, but we also can't do some of the commercial uses we could have done before.
Thank you. I guess I would amplify that or attempt to further clarify it by saying that it's my opinion that downzoning and upzoning are not actually the right way to look at this particular change. Usually it's sort of like a ladder of uses that are allowed, building from low intensity up to higher intensity, whereas this is more sort of a lateral sideways change than something that's strictly up or down in terms of the uses that are allowed. So it's downzoning in the sense that some commercial uses that are allowed under COM would not be allowed under the new zoning. It definitely is the case that it would be considered upzoning in the sense that some residential uses that aren't allowed at all under commercial would be allowed through. I hear the point that it would be, you would prefer that it would be site plan review. Yes, they can, but that represents a considerable loosening of the restrictions that are placed on those sorts of residential uses. So, I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. It goes in both directions. So I don't see it as strictly either upzoning or downzoning. That's just my perspective. Mr. Tucker?
I'd just like to quickly correct a misapprehension that I think was generated by the flyer. The illustrations from Columbia Pike, Virginia, were selected not by the Cecil Group, but by planning staff as we were looking out in the world of form-based code, because it was a particularly clear visual conveyance of the way in which the kinds of regulations operate. It was not doing anything other than that mechanical teaching. It wasn't intending to say this is what North Amherst should look like or what the Cecil Group thinks anything should look like. It was simply a very clear sort of third grade taped to the window kind of illustration of this is how this kind of zoning works.
I also wanted to just mention the fact that a number of years ago, Carolyn Holstein and I did a little study and discovered that the Zoning Board of Appeals actually grants over 97% of the special permits that are requested. So it really, it looks at everything very carefully, but in the end, almost always says yes.
With the potential to impose significant
With
conditions in some cases.
yes. But if you will allow me to continue, the
Sure.
planning board also imposes conditions,
Yeah.
so both groups do that.
All right, further discussion on those two topics. Rob?
I just want to test, I'd like to move that we extend, that we remove the NAVC zoning from the proposal for 134 Montague Road,
Okay.
just to see if there's a second.
I'll second that for purposes of discussion. I think we've kind of
Yeah, we've
discussed
it
our
already.
reasons, but I'm happy to vote on that, actually. So the proposal is to remove the NAVC from essentially the rectangular portion, the extension of the west, or actually be the eastward boundary of NAVC northward through that little finger, and retain the existing zoning on that parcel, that portion of the parcel as RN.
May I ask a clarifying question?
You may.
Are you conditioning this proposal on town moderator's willingness to accept the argument that de facto the form-based overlay district is imposed on that property, even though it doesn't appear on the proposed map, or that some form of form-based, and I'm sure how that would work. You see what I'm saying? That somehow is resolved in favor of having form-based regulations on there, and if it were to prove that they could not be imposed, you just need to consider that option, that you could also end up with this box of property in the middle of a form-based regulation that had no form-based regulations and became a helipad or something
Right,
like
and
that.
in fact, that was the entire basis of the form, but I wouldn't condition it on that. I guess I would take my chances.
Okay. All in favor of that proposal? Opposed? All right, that's a 2-1 vote in opposition, so our position then remains in support of retaining the zoning, essentially the zoning boundaries for NAVC itself as shown in the original article. So to summarize for anybody who's confused by what has happened tonight, although it hasn't been that confusing, but we are very close to it, and most other people are not as close to it as we are. The result of the discussion that we just had would remove the proposal to rezone the area along Montague Road that's shown in green in the map that I'm looking at, and the one that went out in town meeting members' packets. That area had been proposed to change from RN to RBC, and our recommendation to the planning board would be to retain the RN zoning on that, and also to change the proposed regulation of townhouses in the North Amherst Village Center zoning district from the proposal of site plan review to instead be special permit. Both of those are recommendations that we'll make to the planning board tonight. Planning board will make its own decision on both of those. We haven't yet talked about how to approach this in terms of the motion, but my assumption has been throughout that we would actually move that ourselves rather than just responding favorably to a motion from the floor. But we can talk about that at the planning board tonight also. Ms. LaCour?
I just wondered about the townhouses in Atkins, whether you're going to do the same thing. I mean, right now they go together, don't they?
Yes, that's a good point, and it's worth our thinking about. So Ms. LaCour points out and asks about the question of townhouses in Atkins
AC.
Corner. The proposed zoning in the article has them regulated as site plan review in both North Amherst and Atkins Corner. And the question is, is our recommendation to change townhouses in Atkins Corner. Absent a compelling argument for why they should be different in the two zoning districts, I guess I would argue that my position would be that they should be the same, and thus what I've been expressing for North Amherst would apply in Atkins Corner also.
I think that makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Ron?
furthermore, I think there's a case in Atkins Corner that there's a risk that not requiring some commercial development, in other words, by mixed use, that there wouldn't be enough space if townhouses went in without business. So I think it might even be more important in the south than in the north.
In the sense of encouraging business uses.
Yeah, right, encouraging mixed use, requiring mixed use rather than,
Okay.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question is SP in both. All right. The only remaining issue that we haven't really discussed is splitting north and south. As I stated earlier, I'm personally certain that someone will seek to do that if we don't. I actually don't support doing that, and so my recommendation would be to keep it together and not propose that split on our own. But I think that the board needs to be prepared with a position on that. And if the board ends up supporting the split, then I think that we should be the ones that initiate it and not wait for a motion from the floor. So do you guys have a sense that we'd like to bring to the board one way or the other? Rob?
I think it might make it easier to defend the motion if they were split. As I'm planning this, I'm thinking I'm going to be making a half an hour speech to the motion. If I can talk to Atkins Corner separately from North Amherst, I think it would be easier.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be, almost all of our discussion has been North Amherst. So as I'm doing this, I'm writing this up. I'm really just only talking about North Amherst and ignoring South Amherst, but we really should not ignore it. We really should address it, as another, as its own important initiative there. And so I think it would be easier to defend it separately.
We would be happy to assist with the development of the explanation, because there is a closer history of community planning for Atkins Corner than there has been, or more efforts more recently than for North Amherst. What we're looking at now is the recent effort for North Amherst. So,
Bruce, any thoughts?
I think that it's a good idea, and maybe it would be easier to go with Atkins first.
Mm-hmm.
I think it will be simpler, and as you said, Jonathan, there's been more community involvement over the years on this, so I think people have heard the issues there in the past, and they may be more easy to follow. I do think that's a good idea.
Okay. So the way that this is structured, under the proposal that Mr. Tucker has in the second half of this sheet below the word "or," would have us considering essentially Atkins Corner along with all the stuff in Article 16 together first, and then to add on, it would consider the general stuff first, and then it would add Atkins Corner to that, and then it would add North Amherst to that. I do think that there's a risk of complexity overload in doing that. People are already struggling to understand all this, and the more we layer on additional elements, you get to a point where people start looking around and saying, what are we voting on and what's happening? And I do think that this increases that. Sounds like you guys think that that's a chance that is worth taking. Rob?
I think a previous suggestion was 2 motions, not 3 motions. It was form-based and Atkins, I think, and then North Amherst in a second motion. And I think I would prefer that.
if I may, to explain what this second half of this sheet does, it's actually 2 sets of motions. The first motion is to divide Article 17, and that's what 1, 2, and 3 are. And that's what, again, what the description on the back of the sheet is intended to say. The first thing we're going to do is divide this, pop, 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 into these 3 pieces. Now, someone's going to move 1 and 2 together, the form-based regulations and Atkins changes together. And then second, they're going to move North Amherst on its own.
I've been asking Mr. Tucker some questions about this process over the last week, and that's how we kind of got to this place. And one of the things we had been thinking about earlier was having separate motions on those three aspects. So the form-based regulations on their own, and then Atkins, and then North Amherst. And I was concerned about the possibility of outcomes that don't make any sense from that, based on one thing passing and something that it depends on not passing. And I know that's not very likely, but just having the possibility that that could happen concerned me.
Yeah.
So the way that he's proposing structuring it would be that motion A, I move to consider 1 and 2 above, would package the core form-based regulations with the Atkins and have an up or down vote on that. And if that were to fail, then we would probably not make motion B, or I don't think we need to move to dismiss. We would just not make it, because there would be no core Article 16 framework to hang the North Amherst stuff on.
If I may, I think it would be useful for, in either case, if there's a motion by the board to accept a lack of success, that those be motions to refer. Because I think town meeting would need to understand what I understand from the discussion this evening and prior, that it is the intent of the subcommittee to keep on working on this, even if this one doesn't succeed. But that's up to you.
Rob?
And conceivably, you could also, for the second motion, you could move to consider 1 and 3, right? Even if,
I don't know the answer to that.
Someone could move that. I think if the planning board decides to make the motions, then this is the order that makes the most sense based on the discussions that have occurred.
The division, the 1, 2, and 3, is moving to divide, and actually, I'm not sure whether that's a motion or just a request, but it would divide the article into 3 separate independent parts, and Part A would consider 1 and 2 together. If, as you're suggesting, Part B were to consider 1 and 3 together, I'm not sure whether the moderator would
yeah, maybe not.
allow another vote on a portion of the article that had just been
Right,
voted one way or the other, that we could ask him.
Yeah, I was thinking if the first motion failed because people didn't like it being applied to Atkins Corners,
Right.
why not? But you might be right.
Okay. So, let's have a vote on our recommendation here. So would one of you like to move your proposal?
I move to suggest that the planning board move to divide the article and then make more than one motion under the article,
I'll second.
as described here.
Further discussion?
I'll
All-
second.
All in favor? Opposed? That's a 2-to-1 vote in favor of recommending to the board that we divide the article. All right, we are going to confuse the heck out of the rest of our colleagues this evening. Mr. Tucker.
I would like to note that you have before you an emailed message from the Epsteins, one in a series. This is the most recent, dated October 26th, I believe. And it speaks a number of the issues that they had been concerned about in terms of South Amherst, in terms of the Atkins Corner rezoning have been addressed. The issue that remains an issue apparently for Mr. Epstein is the sound generated by the Norwalk Fish and Game Club's skeet range up on the hill. In his letter, he refers to the skeet shooting as being now directed exactly at the projected apartment houses. This is presuming that there are apartment houses on the southernmost of the properties in the AC district. We have looked at that using the town's GIS and determined that the location of the skeet range is actually blocked by the ground, that the ski range is set some distance back on a reasonably flat plateau from the crest of the hill above the properties in question. And if presuming that sound traveled only in a straight line, which it doesn't, but for the most part it does, it would be projecting more than 100 feet in the air above this is just sound, by the way. Shot falls off way before we even get to property lines here. This would be more than 100 feet above the ground in any of the locations that Mr. Epstein is concerned about. So we just wanted to note that his concerns have been received and heard and investigated, and to the extent that we understand, it is not the case that the sound goes directly at any of these properties. It goes over them. There are climatic conditions that can make sound bounce around and go different places. There is about 1,500 feet, linear feet of distance along a forested hillside to help mitigate sound. And it is also the case that a number of ranges in Massachusetts have installed berms at the edges of their ranges, or for that matter, just stockaded fences, which cut the level of sound energy projected beyond the site dramatically. So in any case, that issue has been raised, and we've investigated it, and we have, those are the results at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so the final question we have on Article 17 is just the scheduling issue, which I'm not sure whether we need to make a recommendation to the board, since that's really more a matter of the board's schedule. My own sense is that I think it's fine to do it on either the 14th or the 16th. The 14th is the other reasonable day to consider this. There's already a special town meeting scheduled for the 9th, another issue going on that night. So either one of those is fine with me in terms of scheduling and just overall logistics. Either of you have any thoughts on that?
The 14th is a Monday?
Yes, 14th is a Monday, which would be the third night of town meeting, and the 16th is a Wednesday, which would be the fourth night.
Any thoughts, Ron?
Yeah, I'd prefer extra time to prepare. but-
16th, yeah.
but,
Okay, so we'll talk about that later then. All right. I've lost my agenda, but I don't think that there was anything else of note on there. Jonathan or Chris, did you have anything else?
No, I didn't.
It's only 10 after 6. We need to find a way of occupying the next 45 minutes.
I've got an idea.
You could go eat food.
Rob, go ahead.
This would be under topics not anticipated. It has to do with what we're going to be discussing at the planning board, the Lord Jeff thing. It's as I was looking at it, I think there's a loophole that we might want to address in the future. And that's the idea that a restaurant is an accessory use to an inn. That's what the bylaw suggests right now. But I think it creates the possibility that planning board could permit what would otherwise be considered a Class 2 restaurant in the BN district where it would be a no now. And I think that's, thinking about that made me wonder whether it was really appropriate for the bylaw to say that a restaurant is an accessory use to an inn. I think maybe we should consider it as two primary uses and then regulate them separately rather than together.
Mr. Tucker.
Among the considerations under the current arrangement, and the reason that this is coming back to you, is that the building commissioner has to determine, because it is listed specifically as an accessory use, that it is in fact an accessory use. You can't just do it. And the planning board, neither the staff nor the building commissioner would just accept without comment the planning board saying, oh, go ahead and do a Class 2 restaurant. We're not going to have any further regulation about it, except under the overall inn or hotel or whatever lodging use it was associated with. It has to be demonstrated that it is in fact accessory, which means that it is predominantly serving the institution of which it is a part. That, you know, I think one of the tests that the building commissioner was applying to this was expected service to whom? You know, I've encountered in travels doing various things over the years, many old inns that have a sort of a bar pub associated with them and have had for decades and decades and decades, such that although it's a Tony Inn and everybody comes in with a tie, I can remember doing this once in Dorset, Vermont, where I was staying overnight there, went down to the bar to get some food, and the people, it was the end of the deer hunting season, and there were townsfolk coming in, you know, in their checked outfits and with their licenses on their caps and stuff, and I sat next to a gentleman at the bar who was waiting for his wife to come down off the mountain with the deer that he presumed she had gotten. So it's these are often community institutions, and they're serving a broader community. But in terms of how this gets used now, it must be demonstrated that it is in fact an accessory use and not just presumed. There's a test for that. It's not just, oh yeah, sure, you can do that with an inn. It has to be an accessory use.
Okay, so that is reassuring. So so the building commissioner could say if someone made a proposal for instance, not that this would happen, but for instance, if someone proposed to make 134 Montague Road an inn, which I think is a great idea, but an inn with a restaurant that served alcohol until 1 a.m., building commissioner could say, that doesn't look like an accessory use to me, that looks like a primary use, and that shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, second principal use, and get yourself a permit. Okay.
All right, unless there's anything further, this meeting is adjourned at 6:15 PM. Thank you.